Hello, good afternoon. I'm Alice Kaplan, Director of the Whitney Humanities Center. Thank you to the Department of French for joining the Whitney as a co-sponsor of Juliette Cherbuliez' Medea, a Manifesto. Juliette Cherbuliez is the Director of the Center for Premodern Studies and a professor of French at the University of Minnesota. A comparatist, she's published on the materiality and politics of women's writing in early modern France, tragedy, violence, and visual culture. Her most recent book interrogates these concepts at their core. In the wake of Medea, tragedy and the arts of destruction in Neoclassical France is at the heart of her talk today. I want to mention too her previous book, The Place of Exile, Leisure Literature and the Limits of Absolutism. Here she's concerned with writers who are not considered explicitly political, banished noblewomen, novelists, and poor refugees who sought out a space for writing and living beyond Louis XIV's absolutist reach. In both of these books, Juliette explores what she calls the lost opportunities of the early modern period, concepts, themes, ideas that did not become part of our modernity. She asks questions that challenge many commonplaces, that look at what has been overlooked, that revolutionize our point of view on concepts we think we know, the political, for example. Through her original and powerful readings, Juliette Cherbuliez shows that figures of the early modern period are essential to our own thought. And at the same time, she underscores their otherness so that we not project our own categories onto them. Before we welcome Juliette, please note that she'll be back with us this coming Monday, February 21st at 4:30 as part of the Uprooting Medea presentation featuring visiting artist Shivek Shah, who will discuss his production of Euripides' Greek tragedy with an all-multicultural cast and crew. Shiv will be in conversation with Juliette, along with Yale faculty Christina Kraus in classics and Eric Glover in the School of Drama. And we're putting a registration link in the chat. After Juliette's talk, we'll have a few minutes for questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the Q&A panel and feel free to submit your questions at any time during the talk. Juliette, welcome to the virtual French department and Whitney Humanities Center. Let's get started.
Alice, thank you so much for that warm introduction and to the invitation from the Whitney Humanities Center. I also heartily thank Pierre Saint-Amand and your colleagues in the French department. While it is really unfortunate for me that I am not in New Haven today, this virtual encounter recalls to me times really not that long ago of mobility, conviviality, and shared intellectual projects. In fact, my last professional trip, weeks before the pandemic hit, involved work with Professor Maury Samuels. My last international conference was in Fribourg, organized by Professor Christophe Chouvet. And so in so many ways, this talk marks, for me anyway, a reprise, a taking back up of conversations forestalled. There's one intellectual exchange which not even a global calamity could stop. And that is the one I've had with Associate Director of the Whitney Humanities Center, Diane Barrett-Brown. And for her contributions realizing this event, I am deeply grateful, but for her generosity, grace, and unending smarts that have informed my work for nearly 2 decades, I'm really indebted. So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you here today. I hope you can see my screen. The images are pretty key to this talk. There is a type of news photo that has haunted me, perhaps you too, for about the past 5-6 years. This one might be the most amazing example, but there are many iterations of this composition and the confrontation it records. They capture events all over, from Chile in 2016 to Moscow in 2019, to my adopted city of Minneapolis from just 2 summers ago, and again this past summer. There are other, more bureaucratic versions of this. They represent a type, that of a girl or young woman standing up to institutional power. In North America and elsewhere, especially the global South, often a Black or brown girl, so often a young woman, not from a dominating class. We have been taken by surprise for a long time by the reality of girl power as an ideal of political contestation, but also of gendered resiliency, as we can see in the astonishing assertion that females are strong as hell, to quote the title sequence from Netflix's Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, a show which, when you think about it, explores how PTSD from 15 years of kidnapping, brainwashing, misogyny, and abuse can help a young woman from the Midwest make it in New York. I do understand why we want heroes, ideal people of action. What makes these people particularly heroic? Generally, we don't know or ask what happens after these photos. It's the stance of defiance itself that we admire. I can't help but come back to this one of Aisha Evans, which displays the contradictions of an encounter between the older, seemingly older, versus the younger, the overly weaponized, powerful, and protected versus the unarmed and vulnerable, the many versus the singular. It is the stillness and strength, that resilient, statuesque position here of Aisha Evans against the seemingly choreographed dance of power. It is that which I call the Antigone effect. Antigone has been the darling of political theory since arguably the 18th century. She is, fitting to our story of modernity, an icon of political hope, even as she embodies tragic failure from her obstinate and fearless conviction that she must do right by her rebel brother's corpse and bury it in the face of a royal interdiction, through her self-generated peerlessness as she refuses accomplices or partners, especially her truth-telling in the king's face. Yes, Antigone says to Creon, I did it. I am guilty. And finally, most poignantly, to her lament about her foreclosed future before she is taken away to be walled up, where she is found having hanged herself. Antigone is constituted as a paragon of the individual whose allegiances to her particular, familial, sacred duties compel her to test the state's power and deny its hegemony. There's something surely here about the pure potential of youth. To be sure, if you do attempt to do an internet search of, for example, old woman resist power, or old women against police, or old woman as icon of resistance, you don't find much. If you try really, really hard, you come up with this one. Note that she is walking away. My favorite part of this is actually the handbag. But it can't all be about youth. The Antigone effect I refer to owes its enduring appeal, it seems, rather to a complex of features. To try another tack at that effect, and with a nod to the central subject of my remarks today, a search for an analogous Medea effect yields very different results. This is Peter Ward's 2009 book, asserts that life on Earth tends towards simplicity, not complexity, so involves fundamentally self-destruction. Medea is also the name of a gene in a fruit fly, and as an acronym, it's also the name of an effect of another gene, which has both a toxin and its antidote. So those of you familiar with Medea's story know why these results concern the fundamental act of a life giver taking life. Euripides made her famous for having killed her children, but a full transhistorical consideration of Medea must, however, include how she also betrays her father and kingdom, hacks her brothers into pieces, causes the death of her husband's uncle at the hands of his own daughters, destroys a city, having caused the poison burning deaths of its king and princess. Despite, and maybe because of all these gruesome actions, I am interested in what is to be gained by offering Medea the same attention we have lavished on Antigone. If you came to this talk from the Schwartzman Center, I shall say from the advertisement, I shall say that you may be a little disappointed because I am certainly not here to promote Medea as a salutary icon of positive action, but I am deeply interested in this figure as a political figure and a figure of politics. And what follows comes from my most recent book, which treats the specific case of violence in the 17th century through the lens of what I call Medean violence. And I'll come to an example from that book in a little bit. But today, I want to discuss how Antigone is conceived of in our political imagination first, and then I will return to Medea, that icon of horrorism, as philosopher Adriana Cavarero has called her, and why I think she might be a more important model for a future politics. Okay, so Antigone and Medea have one major aspect in common. Each contests the authority of the state at the time of its formation. This is true in nearly every version. Oh, here is my book. I think we can move on from there, though. This contestation of the state at its formation is true in nearly every version, and here are two of my favorites. Of course, the details of this contestation and the warrants each makes for her sense of justice differ almost diametrically. Antigone is a virgin who grieves, contests, and dies. Medea is a mother who travels, kills, and lives on. Antigone wishes to honor her brother with a burial. Medea chops her brother, Absyrtus, into bits to delay her father's pursuit, compelling him to recover the pieces for burial. Antigone laments her father's curse, whereas Medea carries with her the knowledge bequeathed to her through her house, which includes not just the sun, but masters of the occult, Circe and Hecate. While, for example, this is Judith Butler's argument about promiscuous obedience, Antigone challenges a certain kind of family, revealing the origins of kingship and kinship as both arbitrary. Medea underscores precisely the opposite logic, the steadfast power of family, whether chosen, adjacent, or imposed, her children. Following this logic, Medea traces the promise not of origins, but of the ambiguity of the future. It is crucial that no matter what destruction Medea wreaks, she flies off alive. She's never killed, to live on, and perhaps then to return. So while Antigone stands for a future interrupted, to borrow from Bonnie Honig, Medea is an exemplar at once of an archaism, a kind of pre-modernity we cannot overcome, and a future absolutely guaranteed to arrive, but whose consequences we cannot foretell. So, Antigone. Exercising her private, familial, and sacred task of burying the dead against the emergent ordering of the force of the city, this young and unmarried, childless daughter of Oedipus has come to represent that force of domesticity, the right of privacy, and the family against the overreaching state, the perils and potential of individual resistance, and we shouldn't forget the special kind of powerless power of women in the modern state, which has so often been a test case for the individual inalienable right to self-determination. But has it been effective to assign a young, aristocratic, apparently gendered female all our hopes? It seems that Antigone has become, in our contemporary time, less a model of political action and more one of our inability to marshal a clear and enduring vision of what both the morality and the politics of resistance should look like today. Sophocles' play has furnished us with the grounds for imagining the individual political subject obeying laws that are higher, older, and broader than those of the state, even at that individual's peril. Antigone performs this function as early as the 18th century. Consistent with Europe's rumblings against monarchism and toward liberal democracy, Louis de Jaucourt, the Encyclopédie's most prolific contributor and an expert on legal matters and jurisprudence, even gives Antigone in the last word in his article on the political subject. Refuting Hobbes's argument about loyal subjects working as instruments of the sovereign and therefore bearing no responsibility for the justice of their actions, Jaucourt cites the tragedy's most off-sided and famous scene, the Stichomatia standoff between Antigone and Creon. And he ends his article with this. So he gives Antigone the last word. So from the mid-18th century on, it is this duologue, Antigone's challenge to and refutation of Creon's authority over her private sacred duties, which has become a touchstone for Hegel, Lacan, Irigaray, Judith Butler, and again, to a certain extent, Bonnie Honig. As a scholar of performance and theater, I find this move extracting Antigone from the network of relations and interactions which constitute her and her community within the play reductive. Our ideal Antigone has become an Antigone who defies and contests, whereas in Sophocles' play, she is also an Antigone who primarily takes action by burying her brother. That is to say that tragedy, even when driven by song and declamation, as the art was for Sophocles in the 5th century before the Common Era, is not just about its words. It is also about the deeply material relations and physical gestures that bind us. Tragedy is by design and in performance, neither monologic nor based on soliloquy, not a medium of icons or figures, but one in which it is precisely the relations among characters or the tensions among individual and collective significations that are explored. The tragedy Antigone is, after all, a play about people burying people. The initial tension in the play comes from a debate about who buried a corpse and whether one should bury a corpse. The plummeting shock at the end of the play, when Antigone's own body causes an avalanche of other deaths. Her beloved Haemon, who's also Creon's son, kills himself. Haemon's mother, the queen, then kills herself, which signals the fragility of Creon's own family and therefore of the state. This is an account of action after action. The best model for the tragedy Antigone is not the fight of words such as those between Creon and Antigone, but the consequences of individual actions on a community. Well, some have bemoaned what they call the necropolitics of the tragedy Antigone. Of the tragedy Antigone. What makes me most nervous about its eponym, Antigone the character, is rather two other aspects she's come to inhabit. First, I am wary of the ways we find Antigone hopeful, despite her death, despite the death she brings. Not only do I think this is a confusion of potential with efficacy, it also puts the burden of future change on individuals as if the underlying structures, the polis in which she debates and maneuvers, to borrow from Bonnie Honig again, has always been constituted as such and could never be anything but. My last complaint is this: how is it possible that Antigone meets Creon one-on-one? It is astonishing that she might do so because she's young, because she's defiant, because she seems honest, rigorous, uncompromising. But it's because she is Creon's future daughter-in-law, because she is his niece, because she is a member of the House of Thebes, because she is aristocratic, that she may stand to contest Creon's law, and that she may bury her brother, and that she may marry or even forsake Haemon. Antigone is of the polis and she is of the family, and it is by virtue of these ancient rights, these innate entitlements, that she can, sacrificing herself, destabilize the city. This points again to my discomfort with our appreciation of all those media images of mostly of women of color standing strong in their resiliency. These are not images of how power really works. These are images many can appreciate without suffering the consequences, either personally or structurally. What then if our notion of the political subject did not depart from an aristocratic, youthful subject who is of the reigning house? Might we need to more radically redraw our political family tree by considering the vagaries of geography, conquest, inheritance, and affiliation? To do so might compel us to reconsider who and whose stories constitute the House of Thebes, and who has been excluded from the polis as a feature of its constitution. What if we contended with the very conditions that the tragedy Antigone elides? After all, that tragedy starts in the aftermath of war and finishes with regret for a death not spared and bodies strewn all about. What if the story of politics included the statelessness that war brings home, the persistence of revenge, the state's monopoly of force, and the problem of women who do not die, but rather kill? Or, to put it better, who kill and yet do not die? In sum, the question of the role of violence in the formation and maintenance of society. Appropriate to her final entombment, Antigone's name means, as Anne Carson reminds us, against birth, or instead of being born. We might hope that Medea's name might mean against the mother, or instead of childbearing, since she has been so intimately associated with mothers who are selfish and who kill their offsprings or otherwise eat life. And while Antigone's final words are a lament about never marrying or having children, Medea's major lament decries the pain of childbirth and contrasts it with the trivial wounds of war. Medea's name means rather intelligent planner or contriver. It derives from the Indo-European root med, which Émile Benveniste defines as to take authoritatively those measures which are appropriate. The first syllable of Medea shares the same root as meditate or medicine. Medea's careful deployment of knowledge names the same authoritative care as that informing then deep study or healing. This is why she is so often portrayed as a witch. This ambiguity might explain why the most common visual depiction of her in pre-modern iconography is the rejuvenation of Aeson, Jason's father. Or is it that of Medea killing Jason's usurping uncle, Peleus? The gestures are similar enough to give one pause and to make explicit the connection between healing and killing. You can hear here echoes of Jacques Derrida's pharmakon as the medium for language's undecidability. So the pharmakos, the wizard, the magician pioneer, always encounters its homophone, pharmakos, that exile, sacrifice, scapegoat sent out of the city and ritually killed as a purification and, as Derrida says, a remedy for the polis. Medea is both at once. She is exiled from her own land of Colchis, so a foreigner in Corinth. She will also fly away from Corinth and be a foreigner wherever she goes. She has knowledge that is deemed unnatural to the Greeks because it is foreign and potent. Her estranged position is geopolitical and epistemological. In Medea's actions, the knowledge of healing and killing are linked, as are magician and exile. Two likenesses of Medea speak volumes about this confluence of knowledge and exile. They're both on Roman sarcophagi from the mid to late 2nd century. Both show Medea depicted as herbalist or arsonist, connecting the science of knowing and making with the elemental reality of combustion and distribution. Each depicts the story of Jason and Medea from the theft of the golden fleece to the death of the children, and the story is told on 3 or 4 sides. I'm forgetting now, but it follows the sides of the sarcophagus. Each and you can see right in the middle of this one, you can see an amalgam of both of these crimes: the theft of the fleece and the death of the children, with the death of Creusa, which I'll point out using my cursor, which I hope you can see right in the middle. The death of Creusa after having donned a poisoned robe gifted by Medea for her wedding. This first one is at the Basel Museum of Antiquities. You can see on the left, the children bringing the robe to the bride Creusa, who will be marrying Jason. You can see on the right, Medea in her chariot, flying away with a child slung over her shoulders. And the other one is in there too. At the center, Creusa, as if in movement, her own hand stretched out in front of her. She's running away from the gown that clings to and will kill her. Her father cries out in back of her. And underneath her left knee is a box or a stool ordained with tragic masks. Even more discreetly, behind the 2 children to her right, there is another box hardly visible in this image, but art historians of Rome confirm it is a metonym for the absent Medea. It is the case in which she keeps her herbs. The second sarcophagus, now at Berlin's Museum of Antiquities, is sparser than Basel's. So we're even more immediately drawn to the Creon-Creusa couple, who, despite the available space, this sarcophagus is much less populated than the other one. Despite that available space, are even closer together here, his curly beard nearly touching her flowing locks. The power of Medea is expressed not by such accessories as boxes, but through the metamorphosis of Creusa's hair, that symbol of virginity, and often as it flows before marriage and shearing, youth. a symbol of femininity, and often before shearing and marriage, the symbol of youth and virginity. And you can see that Creus's hair is turning into flames. Part of it, here's a close-up, part of it reaches skyward, touching the frame, as does Creus's hand. Medea's actions, whether she's depicted as an herbalist or an arsonist, connect the science of knowing and making with the elemental reality of combustion and destruction. I have wondered a lot about why I continue to think alongside a figure of such destruction and calculated harm. It comes back to the now classic analysis offered by Bruno Latour in the early 1990s regarding what he calls the modern constitution, that agreement made to distinguish absolutely between nature and society, between humans and non-humans. Medea thematizes a violation of this modern constitution, or perhaps she is simply, as I argue in the book, always pre-modern. Her very old and foreign knowledge inherited from the sun is what confirms her as an interloper in the Greek world who cannot be assimilated. That reminds us that Medea is on the outside both of a Latourian constitution and that of the polis. Medea is doubly foreign. She comes from another place, but she also imports and mobilizes another way of ordering the world. This is what I have come to think of as epistemological alterity, when what and how one knows contravenes the laws of nature and the polis, such as the locals have established them. With epistemological alterity, there is no assimilation. A quick example from the many I might offer from the theater of 17th century France, that most classic of centuries according to traditional canon and periodization, the apogee of absolutism, where order reigned so supreme that even tragedy eventually was disciplined to within an inch of its aesthetic life, as it were. Strict conventions came to prohibit any display of passion on the tragic stage as a matter of decency. Thus, when Pierre Corneille oversees the publication of his complete works in 1660, each play is accompanied not by a representation of a scene that was acted on stage, but ones that were of such violence that they were recounted and described, but not actually played out. So here on the left, from Horace, the battle scene between the Horaces and the Curiaces exemplifies this editorial strategy. It's reported 3 times in the play as if happening just off stage. The tragedy of Medea on the right is the exception to this rule. This is the final scene where Medea, having destroyed the city and killed her children, is riding off in her chariot, and Jason is left on the ground in Corinth. I could talk a lot about why Corneille and his printers deviated from this program and printed a scene that is actually played in the play itself. But instead, I want to return to another image of this same scene. This one is from 1664. It is from another complete edition of the Theater of Pierre Corneille. And I'm just going to blow it up a little bit. It is borrowing from the 1660 edition in composition, but certainly not in technique. Maybe you can see that it's much less capable, not as nice detail, not as well printed. This is an unauthorized version of Corneille's work, printed and sold in Amsterdam. This is an edition that for centuries, up until decades ago, was routinely omitted from scholarly bibliographies of Corneille's work, since it was considered a counterfeit, despite that term being both completely anachronistic and inaccurate. So 19th and 20th century scholars perpetuated in some ways the 17th century's own borders, as if a Dutch printer could not print a French text, or if he did so, was in a certain way transgressive or in excess. Let's look more carefully at some of the other excesses of this image. Let me see if I can get there. Jason is still stage right, while further upstage, 2 bodies remain visible. One is on the ground. The forms are indistinct so that they are not meant, so who they're meant to be can only be inferred. Medea is in her dragon-drawn chariot. although this one is drawn by someone else. What is remarkably different in this image is the prominence of destruction. We can see that the clouds bearing the chariot that appear in both images, in the Amsterdam images, are clearly clouds from the burning building. And in fact, the destruction in this image is far more explicit. And let's see if I can get a close-up there. There we go. Corinth is not only still shown to be burning, flames escape the palace's orifices, but even a skeleton peeks out from the fire above the doorway, grinning, perhaps at the witnesses who are standing below, pointing upward, whether to it or to Medea. The Amsterdam image is an apt symbol for Median violence, a non-authorized version created and circulated just beyond its author's sphere of influence, and also outside of the confines of the monarchy for which classical tragedy would be set to work. It also figures the scale, scope, and quality of Median violence and its legacy in and beyond Calais. Much like this Amsterdam image, for many critics, the violence of this myth is explained in part by the constitution of its eponym. Medea, the character, remains an outsider, unassimilable, whether of female power or of non-European cultures and knowledges. While Antigone stands inside or outside of the city, the figure of Medea has no warrant to be wherever it is. Here again she is, children in tow, the dragon's snake-like body curling through the chariot's wheel. Regular technology is useless for this flight. The snake's sinuating catch also in the wheels also reminds me that while Antigone remains peerless and absolute in her conviction, Medea has no moral purity to stand on and so offers no moral lesson. Always a foreigner, always carrying with and carried by its foreign knowledge, the figure of Medea inserts itself into our community, whether we want it there or not. And while Antigone dies alone, Medea lives, kills, and lives on. Medea's modus operandi is of cleaving to and from others, a politics of attachments and detachment, which offers a radical model, ordering politics according to relations among people, not by vesting the individual in its own license. Finally, then, Medea indicates the extent to which our political order, liberal democracy based on self-possessed individualism, is predicated on the exclusion not just of certain actors, but of certain knowledges. Oh, I said I would offer you a manifesto, and I think I've only done so in part. The problem is, what now? I am not standing here on a rhetorical rampart urging you to follow me. Medea has, I've said several times, no lesson to offer, and nor do I. I maintain that liberal democracy's celebration of the peerless individual has led us astray. But if you are waiting for me to torch this place and then kill my daughter, you have misread me entirely. Rather, I've tried to suggest that the violence of Medea is in many ways here to stay because of how we have constituted both the city and its heroes. Medea's violence is also that of the figure's sense of history. It is relational. It is embedded. I think we need to seek a politics that acknowledges that relational, that embedded, the fundamental injustice and untenability of a city carved out of the included and the excluded. Perhaps also then we need to emancipate ourselves, not just from giving all our hopes to Antigone, but also to stop thinking that we can imagine a world without any Medeas, or that the violence we know that exists in the world can and should be kept away, outside, over there. In nearly every version of her tale, I've said, Medea flies away, never captured or eliminated. If we built a politics based on her sure return and her inevitable inclusion into our ways of being and knowing, what then would our cities look like? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My goodness, I'm reeling as I contemplate the incredible paradox of your title. So I can't really ask you what this politics of Medea would look like, but maybe I can ask you what you might just be repeating from the brilliant talk, but what do we lose? What do we lose when we choose Antigone over Medea?
Oh, that's a really wonderful question. I think when we choose Antigone over Medea, I think I guess maybe I'm not going to put it as a choice if I can answer that question a little differently. Yeah. I think what happens when we've chosen Antigone is we've caught ourselves into a model that says political resistance takes the form in some ways of a sacrifice, and it costs the city very little to accept that as a form of political resistance.
Right, because the political agent has bumped themselves off, right? So no problem.
Yes, and I think that I showed all those images because I think it's so wonderful to see those images of defiance, but we're also trapping people in a bind that women of color often point out, that their strength and their resiliency is seen as somehow miraculous and superhuman, and yet situations don't change for them. And I think it's really important to complement that very famous image from 2016 of Aisha Evans with the one where she's being taken away, because she does get arrested. And I think this idea, this idea of Medea as a heroine also puts the way she's been constituted, because I think this is in part what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a history in the modern era about these figures that doesn't belong to the pre-modern era. And Antigone has been constituted in the modern era as somebody who contests and debates. And I think it diminishes the fact that she also acts, and that all tragedies, even when they're constituted by words, are also about the dilemmas that our actions cause us. And that's where I think Medea brings to the fore. So I guess I've used Antigone as a straw man of some kind, although I think that the problem of Antigone is really important. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I can see why you're resisting the one-on-one comparison. Mm-hmm. We've got a question here. I'm intrigued by your claims about Medea and the steadfast power of family, even as she kills many of them, especially your take that the status of the family speaks more to the ambiguity of the future than the power of origins. It's such a commonplace to think of family as inextricable from origins. Could you say more about this move connecting Medea to an ambiguous future? Manifestos seem very future looking, so it seems like a key move.
Yeah, and I did cop to the fact that I might have failed to give you a manifesto, but that question is actually really, really complicated. So maybe I'll take that first part. The claim about Medea and the steadfast power of family, even if she kills many of them. So one of the things I think that we perhaps don't appreciate as much. Let me answer this in a different way. I was just about to dig myself into a terrible hole. So Medea, I will take an example of one of my most favorite versions of Medea, which is the Pier Paolo Pasolini version, where when Medea kills her children, she sings them a lullaby, puts them to bed, and then kills them with a knife. And the scene is a scene of immense care, of immense tenderness. One doesn't quite see regret in her face. And if you haven't seen this movie, it's a really extraordinary movie. And so Medea, my claim about Medea is that Medea is very attuned to those relations and uses them. The word I use in the book is cleaving to and cleaving from. She knows how to make people join who maybe should not be stuck together. So Creon and Creosa stick together through the burning robe. Creon will eventually perish from that same poisoned robe. And she also cleaves her own children from herself. And what I mean to draw attention to with that analysis is that Medea pays attention to our networked relations. And of course, family is at the heart of that. So I think that family is inextricable from origins. And I think Medea's confirms that, but her uprootedness, her foreign status, also then brings to light the question of the chosen family. Her father of her children is Jason, and he chooses to marry somebody else. So what is the status of family? That's a problem. That's a problem in the ancient world as well as in the pre-modern world. So these are the kinds of questions that the Medea myth asks that the Antigone myth never needs to ask us. And in fact, Antigone refuses a relationship with her sister. She refuses complicity with her sister. So it's also about what's exacerbated and what's put pressure, what the myths put pressure on, and how our inventions of them exacerbate those pressures.
Okay. Another question. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So many questions. Here's one. Is there a way to measure the actual effectiveness, efficacy of Medea's representations on a given society? For example, is there a way to measure how performances of Corneille's Medea transform the socio-political fabric of early modern France? What kind of archives or type of evidence or even method could we use?
Oh my goodness, that's such a hard question. Well, the method I use in my book is to think about not Medea the myth. Medea the myth appears scattered throughout the 17th century, whereas there's very little Antigone. In fact, there's some Antigone, but not frontally. Whereas Medea, but the term that I use in the book is to think about this notion of a persistence of violence that seems to be a rehearsal of the impossibility of violence evacuation from society. So I take Median violence as a form of violence that I think is constitutive of society. So how would I measure the effectiveness of Medea's representation on a given society? Well, I don't think I would. I'm not sure that that's how literary representations work, but I'll say one thing about this. American members of the audience might be familiar with Thomas Noble's really famous painting just before the Civil War about depicting a runaway slave, Margaret Garner, who was captured and killed her two children so that they would not be returned to slavery. And Thomas Noble, this was a great abolitionist cause in the United States, and Thomas Garner made a painting that was printed and that was circulated in popular magazines like Harper's, and really was a key image for abolition. And he titled that painting "A Modern Day Medea." And Garner was an abolitionist. That was not a shock at her having killed her children, at her infanticide. That was an acknowledgement of the disgusting moral conundrum that she was placed in. So we can measure in some ways what Medea means in society, but I'm not sure I could put a science to that in the way that I think the question is asking me. I need to think about that a little bit more. Thank you.
So this is a question from my ignorance of classical theater, but is it true you were showing the Corneille images where there's actually violence on the stage? So does Medea manage to unsettle the bienséance of no violence on stage just because you can't do it off stage?
I'm going to say she doesn't. So Medea is actually performed. Medea is the tragedy that happens before Lucide, and Lucide is that play that generates that whole discussion about bienséance, and out of which bienséance kind of emerges. However, there is, for the insiders, for the 17th century insiders amongst us, I'll just say that what Professor Kaplan's referring to is this huge debate in the early mid 17th century about what's possible to perform on stage, and this notion of bienséance, propriety is one way of translating that, came up, and violence on stage is just unseemly. We can't do it. And Corneille says, do you know what is seemly? It's what the audience wants. He really believes that we should be listening to what audiences want and not telling them. Mm-hmm. And in those pamphlet wars that occur around this other play, Lucide, Corneille prints for the first time his Medea. 1639, he prints it. And so he launches Medea as a firebomb into those debates. I do think that the outcome of those debates was a gradual normative evacuation of the passions and violence from the stage, but what replaced it was incredibly vivid descriptions that are quite disgusting if you read them carefully. And so in some ways, there is this transmutation of hypotyposis, of vivid imagery on the 17th century stage that's quite breathtaking. So I don't think that violence ever goes away. I just don't think it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful issue that goes forth into modern literature with the whole question of restraint and, ellipsis and why you don't see Julien Sorel at the guillotine and things like that. It's wonderful. Okay, questions are coming faster and faster. Here's one. Are we reinterpreting Medea's story in the context of the modern era, or are we rediscovering themes that would have been more obvious to ancient readers?
Oh,
I'm not sure what we means is, I don't know, we in the context.
Yeah. So I'll say what I am doing. In part, I think I'm tracing how this myth has changed in its apprehension over time. So in part, I'm trying to rediscover the ways in which these myths have a kind of sedimented construction, so that when we call somebody today a modern day Medea, as we did Andrea Yates in the early 2000s, that's the woman who was diagnosed with, I think she was diagnosed with psychosis in Texas, and whose family believed that her most important duty was to have children. So she had 5 children, even though her medical doctor said that was not a great choice for her, and she drowned them all in a bathtub. And she was called a modern day Medea. What I'm really interested in there is, does that not seem to imply that Medea is pre-modern, or that we are no longer barbaric? We no longer kill our children, but people before killed their children. And yet infanticide is a component, a feature of our society, as it has been a feature of society in different dimensions and in different ways per society. So that's how I would say, is that we're sort of doing both of those things. And I'm asking you to think about the ways in which you believe that pushing violence out there is the right way to treat violence when it always comes back. Is there another way to treat it? Would be my sort of understanding of how we should think about that today.
So you're not giving us a manifesto, but you are saying we can learn a lot from Medea.
I am.
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah, I'm sold. I'm sold.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. Fantastic talk. Was Medea a big deal on stage in other national contexts in the 17th century, England or Spain, for example, or was it a particularly French obsession? And if so, why?
I am so sorry that I am not as well versed in that question as I wish I were. I do know that there are Medeas in the Italian, and there are Medeas in Spanish. And I'm embarrassed to say that I know very little about English tragedy other than what was given to me in the New York public school system. I don't know, though. The question asks the obsession in France. I don't think France was obsessed with it. And I think we can trace what I call a Medean violence in any culture. And that is to say, attempts at eliminating violence that then transmute that violence into another quality to allow that violence to return and have a certain kind of effect on society. So I'm going to hazard a guess to that that person that that if the theme of Medea is not there, we could trace a Median violence. I wish there were an expert in any of those traditions in attendance who could tell us.
Yeah,
but that's how I would answer.
I'm looking Q&A, folks. Please write in. Maybe you could say a little bit about these modern Medea representations. So you mentioned the fantastic Pasolini, and you showed us an image of Maria Callas. How do they express, I mean, how do they speak to you, those two figures?
So I will say that the Sophie d'Eraspe, I'm just going to talk about the Antigone because I've been Antigone bashing for quite a bit here, but I want to recover Sophie d'Eraspe's Antigone from 2019, which does everything I say that our use of Antigone doesn't do. That the Antigone effect occludes. d'Eraspe's Antigone is an immigrant. It's a Québécois film. She's an immigrant. She is working class, and she takes on an entire system in the name of her brother. The hoops are not big that one has to jump through to imagine that. And so I'm not saying that a figure like Antigone is not recoverable or could not be transformed. What I'm saying is what we usually do with Antigone is something that's very different by focusing mostly on her contestatory words. The Pasolini movie, I think, is really remarkable because it also strives to consider how important history is and how important knowledge is. So one of the things I've tried to insist on in this talk is that I think that the foreigner is a foreigner because of what they know and how their knowledge is scary and potent and not controllable. And Pasolini does a wonderful job of putting those tensions into play, including in his consideration of how history works on children and adults and how lessons are transferred to generation. The other thing I'll say about Pasolini's Medea, if you haven't seen it, you should run and go see it, because it's Maria Callas who's playing Medea, and she is silent. The diva of opera is silent for like 13 minutes. The first 13 minutes of the film, you hear her say nothing. I can't remember. It's not 13 minutes. I can't remember how long it is. But for an incredibly long part of this film, she says absolutely nothing. And the film begins with these atonal music that is in such contrast to who we think we see. The other thing is that I think Callas was in her mid-30s, so absolutely aged. And this Medea is offered as this aged person. And
the
I think
aged witch.
The aged witch. And I think that that's really important. So I think that that's quite remarkable. I could name a few other really remarkable Medeas.
Yeah, give us some suggestions.
Okay. So I will say that the Deborah Warner Medea that was starring Fiona Shaw is probably one of the best known contemporary productions. And it is, the acting is sublime. And I think it's a terrible interpretation. It's a beautiful play. I cried. I absolutely loved what it's a wonderful production. But in an interview, Fiona Shaw and Deborah Warner both said that Medea is a play about divorce, which is very interesting. If you read the Medea play, it's about, it's possible to think about it as a couple folks splitting up. And so they're going to argue about the kids. And that's it. But I think that what that really occludes is the asymmetry in the play between Jason and Medea. And Warner's play does think about that, but it really evacuates the political contestation.
So it becomes like Kramer and Kramer.
Kramer versus Kramer, right? And I want to hold how phenomenal that production was, with a difference I have in its interpretation. That if you want to see Medea as a play about divorce, that is a phenomenal play.
Okay.
And I'm thinking, I'm sort of blanking. I should have.
No, that's great.
There's the Rachel Cusk version of it, in which is very, very controversial. I think was that at the Court Theatre in London, which is very controversial, in which Medea doesn't kill her children; they overdose, and this was seen as an incredible violence to the Euripides, and. I do think that we should maybe stop policing our interpretations of classical tragedies, because I think that there's one thing about classical tragedies, is that they are speaking to the problems, the intractable problems of life in this world with other people. I think that is one of the most powerful things about that. So a reinvention of any of these tragedies is always a good thing.
Always
always
yeah.
Yes, always.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. I understand why the killing of her children is the episode that has stuck in our collective minds, but were all her other gruesome means of violence, the burning, the herbs, the poison cloak, and more, components of the 17th century staged versions?
So I would just like to say one thing, that the killing of the children is something that happens in the ancient Greek version of it, and that's why we have it. That's that innovation. Before that, classicist scholars tell me it is the Corinthian women or the Corinthians who kill the children and blame it on Medea. So part of the tragedy is to make Medea kill her children, to concentrate that violence into one character. So I think that's really important. Her other gruesome means of violence, the burning, the herbs, the poison cloak, and the other components, are very much part of the 17th century staged version. And in fact, Pierre Corneille spends a lot of time really trying, and he says this in his preface, that he really wants to even out the guilt, even out the burden among the different characters. And in his version, Creuse is this, she's avide, she's materialistic, she's grabby, she asks for the coat. She says, you know what I'd really like? I'll spare the children's lives if you get me her coat to Jason. And she asks for it, and Medea says, okay, you want my coat? I will give you my coat, and I will give you more. And that I have an argument in the book about that coat, but there's a way in which Corneille actually wants to distribute blame. He's not interested in concentrating all of that into the Medea figure, which I find really interesting and really telling. The violence and the poison coat and the burning are all part of most myths. And one thing I'll say for folks who are interested in this, just one little thing, is that in the pre-modern period, there are two Medea versions. There's the Medea who burns down Corinth and kills her husband's new fiance, and burns down the city rather, kills her husband's fiance and rides off. But there's also the passionate one, the one who helps Jason take the golden fleece.
The love
and
affair.
Often the love. And you see those on cassone, on Italian dowry chests. You see Jason and the golden fleece, Jason and Medea and the golden fleece on wedding dowry chests. And you see that in frescoes celebrating marriages. And in the pre-modern period, there's no contradiction between those two. Those two versions of Medea can be held simultaneously. That comes from Ovid, by the way, though.
That's very interesting. I think that's a great way to end and whet our appetite for reading in the wake of Medea, Tragedy and the Arts of Destruction in Neoclassical France. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming. And thank you so much for this great opportunity.